And the focus of this is the new anti-bribery legislation in the United Kingdom and the impact it will likely have on SA companies. Steven, thanks very much for joining us on Power Lunch this lunchtime. I've just noticed you've had a breakfast, and I've also received a report on that breakfast, a file, and it says the objective of this report that I've received from you is to provide an overview of the anti-corruption legislative regime in South Africa, dramatic new anti-corruption compliance requirements contained in the new Companies Act regulations, and so forth. How dramatic is this?
It is the most dramatic innovation in the global corruption landscape that we've seen for 25 years. For the last more than 20 years, the United States has been the only country globally that rigorously pursued bribes paid in foreign jurisdictions to government officials. The UK has now just come up to speed as of July of last year, and what they've done is they've created radical new legislation which is far-reaching. So companies that are associated with the UK, that have business operations in the UK, that do business in the United Kingdom, they are subject to this legislation. So a lot of multinational companies that are listed there or have operations in the UK are suddenly having to comply, and it is quite far-reaching. The United Kingdom has introduced a new corporate offence called the failure by a corporation to prevent bribery. So it has brought in onerous requirements for listed entities and other businesses that do business in the United Kingdom.
How closely linked are the new legislations and new measures that have been introduced in the UK compared to what's happening in South Africa? Has there been close cooperation between the two geographies?
There are analogies between the South African legislation and the United Kingdom legislation, Lindsay. The key thing that I think I need to talk about is just the South African government, through the new Companies Act, have introduced some radical anti-corruption legislation itself. The regulations to the Companies Act require listed entities in South Africa, larger entities, even if they're unlisted, there are certain criteria that the entity will have to meet, as well as all state-owned companies. They have to implement the OECD recommendations on reducing corruption. Now, when we extrapolate what are the OECD recommendations, they boil down to almost the same thing as the United Kingdom legislation. The only difference at the moment really is that if you breach the UKBA, there are significant fines that can be imposed by the Serious Fraud Office, which is the regulator authorized to investigate corruption and breaches in the United Kingdom, whereas in South Africa, if you fail to implement anti-corruption policies, processes, procedures, and there is a breach, the only fine that is applicable is a fine that is up to R1 million, which is still significant, but nothing by comparison to what companies can be fined in terms of UKBA. And we anticipate that the regulators in the UK are going to adopt a similar model to the United States with FCPA. And I think everyone knows Siemens have been through a rigorous prosecution. They entered settlements with the German and the authorities in the US. And the fines that were imposed on Siemens for breaches paid in Latin America, Asia, and a whole lot of other countries was 1.6 billion cumulatively.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to single out particular companies, but when I think of corruption, I just think of the thing that I've seen over the last 2 or 3 days on international television regarding HSBC and the money laundering that they are alleged to have indulged in with regard to, for example, the Mexican drug cartels. I suppose that would be one thing. But closer to home, and you mentioned Siemens, but closer to home, the MTN case is an interesting one, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, is that the sort of thing that would be targeted?
That's exactly the situation. Now, with MTN, we've got to remember that they are listed in the United States as well. So potentially they are subject to FCPA, and they can be prosecuted by the Securities Exchange Commission, as well as the Department of Justice in the United States. And potentially also they may be prosecuted locally in South Africa. And I think we read just a short while ago that the Hawks had initiated an investigation into the allegations that were made in respect of MTN.
I wonder how widespread this is, Steven, without getting into too many details. When you start digging, you do tend to find quite a bit more than you expected. And as somebody said the other day with regards to some other matter, I think it was, there's never just one cockroach. There's a whole load of them swarming around. And I'm not talking about within a particular company, but within the economic sector. If there's one company doing it, then you can bet your life that others are doing it too.
Absolutely. Corruption is a major global problem, and in South Africa it really is prolific. And I think the innovations and interventions that have been brought about by the regulations to the Companies Act are much needed, and I certainly hope that that is going to make some inroads. But the UKBA is probably the most radical intervention because it forces companies to put the processes in place. So companies have to convey that they are anti-corruption focused and they will not pay bribes in order to secure contracts and do business. But they also have to do due diligence on business partners, agents and intermediaries to make sure that those entities don't pay bribes on their behalf. And then they've got to communicate, train and monitor the situation. But what that means here in South Africa is if you've got a local South African company that has operations in the United Kingdom and they're also entering into different parts of Africa, they are going to have to do rigorous due diligence on every venture that they make into Africa. Because when we look at the Transparency International Anti-Corruption Index, we see that 2/3 of Africa scored points of less than 3 out of 10, which is indicative of endemic corruption. And in many of those countries, it's almost impossible to do anything or to get governmental decisions in your favor without paying a bribe. So a lot of large businesses are going to have to think twice about whether they go into ventures in Africa. If the landscape and the environment is too corrupt to operate, they're going to have to withdraw, and that's going to come at a cost to business. And the other thing that's going to happen is if they do go into those jurisdictions, they're going to have to put in some serious anti-control measures to mitigate the corruption risk.
Stephen, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks,
That's Steven
Lindsay.
Powell, anti-corruption expert at ENS.